in a moment, but I just wanted to confirm for everybody and do a mic check. So I'm just wondering if, starting with MLA Bonnet Rouge, you guys can go through and just say hello. Good morning. I now call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development to order. My name is Caitlin Cleveland and I am the MLA for Cam Lake and the chair of this committee. The NWT Legislative Assembly Standing Committee on Social Development is made up of regular members who can look deeper into social issues affecting NWT residents. Committee has identified one of its priorities as exploring ways of increasing and improving housing stock, as well as access to housing according to the needs of small communities, regional centers, and Yellowknife. Committee is currently meeting with community stakeholders to focus on the challenges and barriers faced by NWT residents in regards to home ownership and private market rent. Committee will provide recommendations to the Government of the Northwest Territories related to changes or improvements to programs and services that support both home ownership and private market rentals in the Northwest Territories. Our first order of business is to open our meetings with a prayer, and I will ask MLA Bonnet Rouge to offer this morning's prayer. MLA Bonnet Rouge, are you able to hear me?
Oh.
MLA Bonnet Rouge, your mic is now open and the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you, MLA Bonnet Rouge.
Okay, I started everything there, but I'll restart it and just saying Mussy for the presenter for appearing before us today, and to the regular committee members that have joined us, and any others. And also, we have many things to be thankful for today, as the sun is shining brightly and strong, and it lifts the spirits of the people up. We all await in our communities for the spring hunt and the traditional activities we do out on the land. We really look forward to that. I just want to say to the Mussy, to the Creator, we ask your blessing and guidance for good health and good thoughts for all the people up the Northwest Territories. We look to your guidance to lead us down the right path as we make decisions for the people. We ask nothing more than the simplest things that life has to offer. Mussy.
Thank you, MLA Bonnet Rouge. Our next item is review and adoption of the agenda, and I'll pass it to yourself, Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today we have one presentation from CloudWorks, which is a real estate investment company situated in Yellowknife. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. Members, are there any amendments that anyone would like to see to the agenda this morning? Hearing none, can I get a motion to approve the agenda? Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Emily Knockleby has moved the agenda for us today, and having reviewed and adopted the agenda, are there any declarations of conflict of interest today? Seeing and hearing none, Today, committee, we will hear from Mr. Rob Warburton, who is the co-founder of CloudWorks, a real estate investment company here operating in Yellowknife. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels, and presentation materials will be available on the Legislative Assembly's website following this meeting. To respect physical distancing requirement, all witnesses will be attending via video conference, and I can confirm that today members are as well. I would like to remind all members and our witnesses that all comments, questions, and remarks will need to be directed to myself as the chair, and both members and the witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. I will now ask members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with MLA Knockleby.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Members, anytime you want to jump in, if everybody can please go through and introduce themselves on the phone lines and on video conference as well. Thank you.
Ron Bonnetrous, MLA Decho.
Rocky Simpson, MLA here River South.
Jackson Lafferty, MLA Mofi.
Lisa Semler, MLA Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Kylan Johnson, MLA Yellowknife North.
Perfect. Thank you very much, members. And I will now turn the floor over to Mr. Warburton to introduce himself and to proceed with his presentation for us this morning. Welcome, Mr. Warburton. We're very happy to have you with us here today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for having me here to present on my thoughts on housing and annuity. Little background on myself. We're a small real estate investment company here in Yellowknife, buying commercial and residential properties. Doing that for about a decade. We mostly focus on our commercial stuff on small business incubation and NGOs. On the housing side, we really focus on kind of longer term market rentals. And we are quite active around housing policy and advocacy. Work with the City of Yellowknife, a lot of the policies they're working on currently, and engage a lot of NGOs when it comes to different advocacy and policy stuff around housing. Really where we find most interesting, kind of the thing we like to kind of try to address is this barrier between policies and processes kind of hit the real world of owning, operating, and actually using spaces. Because there's a lot of inconsistency that we find between what's in policy versus what's actually practical. So, next slide, please. So basically, presentation about what we feel needs fixing. So I'm going to speak to kind of three things: housing policies and kind of market financing. These are the ways that some policies that we see currently don't match the reality of actually running and financing market properties. I'm going to talk about property insurance, and I'm going to talk about kind of using what we have to a higher and better use. Next slide, please. So housing policy and market financing, really I'm going to speak a lot to Yellowknife. This is where I live and operate, but a lot of this will apply to the communities as well. There's really two different residential operators. In the north, there's your large corporate, publicly traded owner-operators, and then there's small landlords like myself. And the way we operate is very different financially. As a small landlord, I deal with small traditional financing and banking, which has very rigid rules and regulations, whereas large owners, they're publicly traded, they have shareholders, their financial operations and motivations are very different. And this matters as we get into some of the policies I'm going to talk about, because the motivations are very different depending on the market that you're dealing with. So first, I want to talk about BC and income support policies. So I've had a number of income support tenants in our residential properties, and the current process is that income support guarantees that housing for 30 days at a time, and that person needs to make positive choices. I understand why that policy exists. The goal is to get that person to a spot where they don't need income support possibly anymore. As a landlord, that puts us in a really doesn't match the financing reality of a property. So I have a condominium I rent out here in Yellowknife, and we've had a couple of income support tenants in that unit. Imagine someone coming to you to rent something you've put your life savings into, and their job is only 30 days at a time, or their income is only guaranteed 30 days at a time. That's a really hard ask of a small private landlord, because if that support is cut off, now that tenant doesn't have the ability to pay rent. But the Tenancy Act still applies. So I still have, I still have to work with that tenant, and through the Tenancy Act, try to either come up with a plan for them to stay, or if they can't, I have to work on a plan for them to leave. So it's a policy that doesn't match the financial and operating reality of actual renting a market rental. And I know that this is a big barrier. Like a lot of income support tenants find it hard to find market rentals, and I would argue this is why. It's not because they're on income support. It's because their ability to pay is only guaranteed for a month at a time, which is a lot of risk to put on a small landlord. Again, larger landlords in town that have a lot of doors, not so much, because they can kind of they're dependent on that one unit to pay their bills, but I am. So it's quite challenging to deal with that. I've had a number of housing corporation leases. So housing corporation, when they go, they rent hundreds of units in Yellowknife on the rental market. Dealing with housing corporation as a leasing entity, to say frustrating would be light. I understand they have their own internal financial requirements around signing long-term leases or short-term leases. But really, I just want to speak about experience I had. So I was trying to purchase a property here in town, had 8 rental units in it. 6 of the 8 rental units were housing core leases. Now, their long-term rental contract had expired, so they were all month to month. So I'm trying to purchase a building and keep that building local as opposed to Southern owned. And the banking world I deal with doesn't find, there's little value to them in month-to-month leases. I understand why the housing court did it. It's easy to maintain just the same thing. Retendering, kind of putting it out for longer leases, it's easy to stay where you are. But we required longer-term leases. And just trying to have that conversation with the housing corporation for them to kind of try to work with us on something that would allow us to finance and buy the building was very difficult. Couldn't get to decision makers, and they just moved them into a large corporate landlord. So in the end, they moved all 6 of those tenants out of that building into a building where they could go month to month. So it doesn't really matter. The leasing structure currently how the house core operates doesn't really work or match or really accessible for a small landlord like myself. So this is why consequentially you're seeing hundreds of units go to large corporate landlords in Yellowknife, and very, very few are kind of locally owned private rentals. I looked at housing corporation in my building. I have different financial metrics than larger owners. And then the last thing I want to chat about a little bit is kind of the new housing process. So at one point I used to build houses, bring in houses and build houses. No longer do that. But the current process that the government has for procuring houses or building houses, I find it's very detached from an efficient market. So currently, what the government does right now, you want a new house in a community, for example, or is it goes to tender and it's very prescriptive. You got architectural drawings and design drawings, and for various reasons. But I would like to note, if you look at the city of Yellowknife, 2/3 of our city is prefabricated or modular. And there's a reason for that. That is how we have affordable housing in this market. And the fact that that is not, alternative ways of building housing is not explored a lot more. The government's contracting housing is not lost on the private sector. So I understand there's a lot of other metrics there. There's local employment. There's a lot of priorities mixed in there, but it's from a pure goal of having housing and affordable, accessible units for people. The way that we currently approach building new housing in the north is it's not very cost effective, and the goal is housing. It's not, I think, getting the best bang for buck. Next slide, please. So I was probably one of 5 people that found it very exciting that this came up in the Assembly, insurance. So this, I think, in the next 5 or 10 years is going to become the pressing issue around home ownership in the North. So we currently own units in condominiums, so part of condominium corporations, as well as individual homes. There's been, in market communities like Yellowknife anyway, there's been an exponential increase in insurance rates year over year, especially condominium corporations are seeing multiples increases over the last few years. And a large part of this is why I got this photo in this slide. For homeowners, an example here is fuel spills. So there's a fuel spill that a friend of mine just dealt with in the last few years, and it was well north of $1 million here in Yellowknife. So what's happening is as the perception of risk for private sector insurance goes up, the coverage is getting expensive and the providers are dropping lower and lower. So there's 2 less providers for fuel oil tank insurance in the North than it was last year. So it's going to become, I don't think very far in the future, we're going to have little to no access to private market insurance in places that are already struggling to find insurance. I think even Yellowknife is going to have a problem, particularly on homeowners insurance in the next couple of years here, because these companies they're risk adverse, they're national, we're a rounding error to them, and if especially for example fuel spills, if those claims keep going up higher and higher, they just won't offer it. So there's some, I think, a real big need for the government to explore, and I know it was mentioned already, but some kind of public sector option where the territorial government has some kind of coverage option to cover places where there's no market insurance. There's plenty of communities like that right now, and I know there's a goal as assemblies to provide home ownership to a number of 100 units. That's never going to happen if they can't be insured. So doing that work to have some kind of government or non-market insurance option, I don't think it's going to be a nice to have. I think it's going to be a need to have very soon. Next slide, please. And this is really, using what we have, this is really the core of my entire business and how we operate. There's a lot of focus, and there should be, on new housing and bringing new supply online. But I find what often, all the time, gets ignored is really using what we have better. We have a lot of infrastructure in the North. We have a lot of homes and communities. We have a lot of buildings in Yellowknife that are just used very poorly. And there's various reasons that they are that way. So, when I see all the condition of public housing units, even in Yellowknife, what I see is really poor asset management. I know if I owned a building, I would never let it get to a state where it requires massive renovations and repairs. So I would have a very, I'm very on top of maintenance, care and maintenance of properties. I understand, like something like the housing corporation, it's very decentralized how care and maintenance happens. But I think this isn't like, it's cost you more later. It's like prevention is cheaper than the cure. So there's not a lot of focus, not enough focus, I think, on maintaining what we have currently. There's a lot of focus on repairing it when it gets too bad. It just costs more. So I see a really inefficient asset management there. I understand it's very complex, especially in communities where you've got different groups handling maintenance. It's very decentralized. But if the goal is to have long-term, good, sustainable housing here, we need to focus way more on making sure that it stays in good shape. And then I find a lot of policies around how the government will either purchase or fund nonprofits to access housing. So this slide did have it in it. I can't stop there right now, but there's a picture of Aspen Apartments here in Yellowknife. This to me is like the prime example of not using what we have. So it is a 36-unit federally owned apartment building, which has been empty for years. We talk about affordable housing issues in the North. We just had a rapid housing initiative where a number of local Yellowknife NGOs in the city put a lot of work into building new things or buying new things. That is exponentially more expensive than this building. So Aspen Apartments, it has a number of issues with it. It's not accessible. It's got asbestos and drywall. I'm sure it's a laundry list of things, but it's here. There's 36 units that are here that we can occupy today. So Is it perfect? No. Does it meet all the requirements for accessibility? And no, it doesn't. But that's like, for me, that's like aiming for A version. There's a C or D version available, and you can get there eventually, right? We're just not using the stuff we have really well. So, and I think this really comes down to, this kind of ties into the funding policies and really the toxic risk aversion. The GMT and the federal government will rent units that have asbestos. They'll rent units that are poorly maintained, but they won't own them. They won't buy them. So I don't, and it could save a lot of money and it could bring a lot more units online. But I find there's a disconnect between, and this is not just GMT, like, CMHC, some of their funding requirements are, there's a ton of asbestos, all kind of contaminant testing and stuff, which should be identified, but to not do something because it has, say, asbestos in the ceiling and leave 36 units empty, to me is kind of ridiculous. It would, that's a risk to know and try to address, but not using what you have and with the idea that you're going to wait for a brand new thing whenever it shows up, to me is kind of backwards. So, yeah, that is my short and sweet presentation. I would love to take questions from you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warburton, and thank you very much for your presentation today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and to present from your experience on the ground as a landlord north of 60. And so I'm going to pass this over right away to committee members for questions, and I'm going to start with MLA Knockleby. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Rob, for the presentation. I think a lot of what you were saying are items that we as a committee have heard a lot already. You spoke a lot up to me, or things about efficiency and asset management, et cetera, that really speak to me as an engineer. When we had the Housing Corporation in front of us talking about their tank replacement, or the help with giving people tank replacements, et cetera, I asked them afterwards if they, looked at the sites after, looked at the ground as they were doing the replacements, or any of their people doing the assessments, and they didn't even collect that information to see whether or not there was any staining or evidence of environmental issues before that. So I would agree. I think there's a lack of sort of that efficient or maybe private sector mentality sometimes there. But also just going forward and being proactive is not how this government seems to operate, or most governments, I guess, I should be fair. But it really comes down to me, it seems to be about liability. When I look at the Aspen Apartments, I was involved with the YWCA, there's asbestos in the drywall. So if a unit gets kicked in, a hole gets kicked in, once that tenant actually tells the landlord it's happened, then they're going to trot in all the hazmat suits to do the abatement. So it becomes really, really high risk in that sense, even just from like a PR perspective of watching people trot in, and then you're putting marginalized people into those units, and then it will be, we're not getting the same quality. So there's a lot of complication around taking on those old assets. I do agree we should be looking at using them better. I'm not sure that I really actually have a question for you. I really highly agree with pretty much everything that you said about using our things better. So maybe, I guess, just your thoughts on how do we work towards the government's fear, or reducing the government's fear of that liability? It comes around too when we're looking at, say, things like the women's shelters and trying to put the daycares in and being held to sort of these building code standards that, make sense, but we don't have that ability in the north. So I guess I'm looking to see if you have any solutions towards that kind of conversation, or how we can deal with that. Thanks.
Thank you, MLA Knockleby. Mr. Warburton. Mr. Warburton, are you muted or frozen? I think we may have unfortunately lost our presenter there, and I'm hoping we can get him back. So I might just see if I can touch base with him here. Thank you, members. We'll just see if we can get our presenter back online here.
If I can interject, Madam Chair, this shows that we need to be improving our internet.
I fully agree that internet access is well needed across the north for many different reasons. Okay, we're going to try and, I think he's logging back in now, and so if everybody can just kind of take 2 minutes and refresh your tea maybe. Thank you. Mr. Warburton, are you able to hear us okay?
Hi.
And just out of curiosity, Mr. Warburton, were you able to hear MLA Knuckleby's question in the end, or did we lose you before that?
Right when we started asking the question, if I could please.
Sorry, so you did not hear MLA Knuckleby's question?
I did not.
Oh, okay, I'll turn it back to Emily Knockleby. Do you want to just repeat the final sentence of your question there, Emily Knockleby? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I won't continue on with my ramble about efficiency and government assets. My question, I guess, was around, I feel like the government is very risk adverse, liability averse, and that's a lot of what dictates these decisions around housing, because, you know, they have to meet certain standards in the South, and the building codes are national codes, but they don't always seem to work up here. So my question was more around, I guess, do you have any solutions to how we can work with the government, or how we can sort of move away from that liability sort of risk adversity that they have and be towards more practicality with what we've got? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Mr. Warburton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's hard to ask private sector. Like, if I had a building with asbestos in it, I'd make a, you know, it couldn't sit empty for me. So I would need to have people in it. Just having a plan to address those things as they come up. We seem to want to solve every problem ahead of time, and it stops us doing the thing. Whereas kind of a more of a use what you have approach, I think, would be, okay, so how do we use this as it is right now? Does that mean that a unit gets kicked in and you have to have, you know, that unit sealed off and hazmat suits? And yeah, that might be how you have to operate that. But that means that there's 36 people that have a house. So it's hard, it's not easy, but, you know, waiting for, you know, $1 million, a couple $1 million to clean it up all in one go, and that stops you from doing the project. You're now not housing 36 people for how long? So to me, it's kind of a, the risk aversion is a, government, I think, assess it like a legal kind of like, you know, what's the, and they do, I understand why, but I don't feel there's a factor of like, what's the consequence of not doing the thing? And the consequence to me is you're not housing people. So kind of weighing that as the goal versus complete risk aversion. In my opinion, governments exist to take risks the market won't. And in this case, the market will take a risk that the government won't, which I think is kind of bad. Yeah, like the government rents right now units that are full of asbestos, and that seems to be okay. So why can't we own them?
Thank you, Mr. Warburton. Follow-up, MLA Knockleby?
Yeah, and as another private sector person, I would agree with that, that, you know, you wouldn't be able to sit there with your building empty and afford that. But when the government isn't, you know, people in the government are making decisions regarding, and I'm not trying to slag individual workers or anything, but are making decisions that are not their own money, it doesn't have the same urgency or impetus. And if it's not affecting them directly, whereas, you know, they know people.
MLA Knockleby, you seem to be frozen, so you may need to repeat your question. We may have lost MLA Knockleby. And so if we get her back, then we'll go back over to her for her second question. But in the meantime, we will, this is a bit of an advertisement for Northern Internet at the moment, but let's turn it over to MLA Bonnet Rouge, please.
Merci, Madam Chair. Regarding your comment there, I just want to note that last week Starlink sent some satellites into the orbit. Yeah, merci, Robert, for your presentation. I'm kind of not knowing where, and probably the public too, want to know what is CloudWorks? Who is CloudWorks? Where are they from? And what is their functions or something? Merci.
Thank you, MLA Bonnet Rouge. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I should have led with that. So I guess at the core, we are a very traditional real estate investment company. We own commercial and residential real estate. Which has made us like keenly aware of of operating a space, and very interested in policy and advocacy work, because it was often barriers I hit in kind of trying to finance or use a space. And I can see it happening for NGOs. I can see it happening for the government. So where we could, we've tried to kind of assist with policy and processes. That's a passion of ours, and we spend a lot of time on it. Probably should spend more time on running buildings. But that's kind of where we're coming from. And then, and then particularly work with NGOs. It's been hard to watch a number of NGOs around different real estate assets and buildings. You kind of watch it crumble because there hasn't been this knowledge, this ability to access knowledge, I guess. So we're just a private market operator who sees a particular need to kind of inform our community on how things are working. Lately, we've been doing a lot of advocacy work with the City of Yellowknife. They have a new community plan. They have a new bylaw coming in, all very policy and kind of dry. But some really exciting things around kind of using our space better, increasing density in our city, growing the tax base. But if the policies don't match how people actually live and build and finance buildings, which they often don't, then this doesn't work. So the best policy in the world is no good if you can't build it. So so that's kind of long version of what we do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warburton. MLA Bonnet Rouge?
Yeah, merci for that. Because I haven't heard about your company at all outside of. I assume you're in Yellowknife. You didn't say, but I don't think we hear your organization outside of the Yellowknife. So I don't know how you work with anyone outside if you're just strictly inside of Yellowknife. But anyways, my other question is, I heard your comment that affordable housing is modular housing. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that, Merci.
Thank you, MLA Bonnet Rouge. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. That comment's more around, so the market, like if you give the open market a chance to provide a product, they're going to do it in a way that is the most efficient and affordable to the customer. That's the premise. So the City of Yellowknife is well over 2/3 modular housing, and that's our entry-level housing units in the city, and they're all modular and prefab for a reason, because that is the method to get a house into the city at a price point that average income Yellowknifer can afford. And it seems that we seem to do a lot. I know, particularly in tenders for housing in communities, we do a lot of stick building. And I understand there's various reasons that we do that. There's economic development in communities, hire local contractors. I totally understand those metrics. But the end result is you get a house that's way more expensive than maybe some modular options would have been. So to me, I'm just seeing what the market does, and the market, the way we build affordable market housing in Yellowknife is modular, and I just don't see that translated to a lot of other applications in the north. And I know there's very reasons why it doesn't happen, but if your goal is purely an affordable living unit, I don't see modular happening in a lot of other places that aren't market. So really, given that, to see if that can work up here, that'd be something I'm surprised I haven't seen. So.
Thank you, Mr. Warburton. I'm going to pass the floor over to MLA Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to comment, and and I think it's probably not something new and something that we don't know, and that's that government and and the NWT Housing Corporation are not known to use funds efficiently when it comes to providing the much needed housing we need here in the north, whether it be public or market. But what's exciting, I think, now is that with this 100% dollar that we are getting from the feds, and I'm glad to see that it's bringing out more developers and and manufacturers and businesses that are interested in looking for solutions to try and alleviate the housing deficit that we do have in the north. And I guess we've had a few presentations so far, and there's some that that I hear that are probably more geared to the smaller communities. Listening to this one, it seems to be more geared to Yellowknife, but that's okay though, because I think out of all that stuff, what I'm hearing is some new things and some interest there. So I would ask, I guess, Rob, what how do you see private sector assisting in providing housing, whether it be public or market, in the smaller communities, outside of say Yellowknife, Hay River, or the bigger communities? Do you think that there's a place for the private sector to offer that in the smaller communities? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warburton. Thank you very much, MLA Simpson. Mr. Warburton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's a really tough question. I think a lot of the issue around small communities and private sector investment is around some things I talked about. Private sector by nature doesn't have deep pockets, right? Everyone needs to finance everything. So if I'm building a house in a non-market community, will a bank finance that? Can I get insurance for that? The answer is often no. And then I know, like CMHC, a lot of their affordable housing programs have like a 5-door limit. And oftentimes, like, a community just doesn't need, need one house, or you need a duplex, right? So I think it's more, I think the market could potentially address some of the housing needs in communities here. But I just think and it's not even just territorial, there's federal issues around that funding too. Kind of getting CMHC to adapt their programs for a tiny, 1 and 2 unit affordable housing developments, because it's really geared towards someone doing, 20, 30, 100 units. That's kind of their whole program. So the North is quite challenged to do that. And then the land part too. So in a lot of non-market communities, you can't get a mortgage, and because you can't get title. So to have the market come in and build a house and say have a rental unit in the community or a couple rental units, it's a very hard from, I think, a financing perspective. But this is kind of, I think, where the GMT could help. If there was some kind of non-market insurance for these communities, and try to work with private sector to try to figure out a financing model that could work. Again, the traditional small landowners doing with traditional banks are just hard pressed to finance stuff outside of major centers. Doable, yes. It's a tough nut to crack, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Warburton. Follow up, MLA Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, financing, I see, is one of the biggest issues. in the smaller communities financing projects, and it's getting tougher. This morning I was just talking to somebody who informed me they tried to, even in Hay River, is remortgaging, and now the banks are saying, well, if your house is on blocking, we're not interested in remortgaging or place a mortgage with you. So, in you look at the north, many of our units are on blocking and screw jacks. So I think they're looking, they're tightening up here, and we have to find, I guess, new solutions. So what I'm hoping is that, the private sector themselves as well, can jump in and assist in making sure that we do have housing for people, and also more importantly is to really take a look at the housing corporation and let us know what their deficiencies are, where can they do better, because it's private sector that you're working with a limited amount of money. It's your money. It's not government money most of the time, so it's you're going to look after it a lot better. And I think that I'm hoping that organizations, businesses like yourself, will be vocal, and not just because there's 100% dollars out there, but beyond that as well. I think that at least for myself, I'm always willing to listen, and I'm always willing to look for new solutions, because with the waiting lists that we do have for public housing, they're just too high, and we have to do something because it's causing a whole bunch of other problems as well. So, I look forward to, I guess, hopefully maybe talking to you some more about this later on at some point. But I'd like to thank you for the presentation.
Thank you very much, MLA Simpson. Mr. Warburton, did you want to make a comment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there is a lot of there's markets where the private sector just won't be able to provide housing, but I guess it's obvious to everyone the current approach to kind of managing these buildings and the current approach to building them, it's not working. It's not fast enough, but we keep doing the same thing. So in different approaches, because keeping doing the same thing is not going to solve this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Warburton. I'm going to pass the floor over to MLA Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can I just confirm that you can hear me first?
Yep, we can hear you.
Thank you. I was having some microphone issues earlier today. Thank you. I don't necessarily disagree with anything you said, and I think probably there's a few places the GNWT has to step into and get uncomfortable, and that those areas of insurance, title, taking on a bit more risk in its tendering are all areas that will help us allow the private sector to step in to smaller communities and even fill that gap in Yellowknife. Similarly with the leasing, the Yellowknife, essentially the housing corp leases a couple hundred units from large corporate landlords, and then nonprofits also go lease some more from tendered at very large scales. Anything such as a boarding house or a duplex kind of wanting to incorporate income assistance. And actually what I've been seeing with my constituents who are landlords who have traditionally had income is they're getting out of the game because they find income assistance just too frustrating to deal with. They've been willing to, if their tenant misses a productive choice, to kind of tolerate some of that and work with them to make sure they get their next income assistance check. But, I don't think there's many people left in the private sector who want to do that. And I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head about 30 days is not, it's asking a private sector landlord to take on too much risk. But I guess leading into that question, where is that line of where, you view a smaller landlord being able to take on an income assistance tenant? Does it have to be a 1-year signed lease to give you that security? If we bump income assistance at least the housing portion that goes to landlords up to 90 days. Does that encourage people to get into the market more? Or I just want to, I don't think 30 days is, but I'd like to get your sense on where you can move that spectrum to kind of convince people to rent to income assistance tenants. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, MLA Johnson. Mr. Warburton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the question. I guess you got to think about if a tenant comes on income support and wants to rent, really what they're competing against is the rental market. So the rental market in Yellowknife, the standard is a year. So for me to find a tenant that will commit for a year is not difficult. That's kind of the metric. So I guess the ideal would be a year, because then it's an income. For me, it's an income-based decision, right? Can this person afford to pay rent without it taxing them to a point where they're not going to be successful? So in my opinion, I feel like why income support tenants may not have success getting smaller landlords to rent to them is because they have other options. That they can rent to more stable income individuals. So having recipients kind of be able to commit to that year, or income support committing to, I say, a year lease, then I think a lot of the issues around renting from small landlords or renting in general with income support diminish, because then you're playing on the same market, right? So this kind of goes back to the policy is there for a reason, right? They want practical choices. They want to kind of go off income support. But it doesn't. They want to rent in a rental market, but they don't want to operate in the model that market operates in, right? That market's 1 year leases, and income support wants to do 30 days. They just don't match. Anything get closer to matching what the rest of the market is doing. They say they don't make a practical choice, and then. Like I said, the tenancy applied.
Mr. Warburton, we seem to be losing your connection again a little bit there, just to let you know. Many members are finding that breaking up, so I'm not sure if you can hear me at all, but it seems like your internet is playing games on you again today. Mr. Warburton, are you able to hear me okay? Well, this will end up being good material for Sketty down the road when they're working on their digital infrastructure priority. We will try to get Mr. Warburton back again, and my apologies to the public. It seems that internet is just not our friend today, but we are trying hard to keep it going. And Mr. Warburton, are you able to hear me okay?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you now. Perfect. Sorry to interrupt. So if you can just continue on with your answer to MLA Johnson. Thank you.
Basically the income support policy doesn't match the market they want their recipients to rent in. So making those two things align as much as possible would bring more options to income support renters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warburton. MLA Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I guess my preference would be that income support try and find a way to get people to back 1 year leases. And I actually don't think that's a costly of an ask. Essentially people from income assistance are already getting 1 year's worth of rent. They're just hopping around trying to find landlords willing to rent with them. So I actually think it would encourage more landlords to build rental units. I guess the other area that I think is the crux of how, dollars in housing money, most of that will be modular because that was how the federal government wanted the rapid rehousing money to go. But But the crux of the housing debate to me is, do we stick build where we build capacity and, at a cost of, modular? So, is it worth it to have better designed houses, better built houses that, employ northern contractors and build that local capacity versus getting for that same price that don't necessarily do that? And I guess the Housing Corp is still of the view to hang on to stick built and, not jump fully into modular. And I go back and forth on this every day, but, I guess there's not really a question there, but, can you perhaps just speak to, what is the market currently building that is profitable? So what are private, I in any community, even Yellowknife, but what do you have to do to make something profitable? And then should the Housing Corp be looking at that and seeing whether it makes sense for them to replicate that model, which to me is mostly modular. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Emily Johnson. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. So in Yellowknife specifically, we've built over 700 new units, like units being housing units in the past decade. All those are almost exclusively been multifamily, so condominiums, or modular. So Hall Crescent in Yellowknife is the latest example. So there's a reason for that is the density of condos make the math work for building, and modular is importing southern labor essentially. So the market is saying either high density or modular. That's what the market can build and do at a profit. To my knowledge, there's been maybe a dozen actual rental units built, purpose-built rental units in the city of Yellowknife in the past decade. And that's, by large corporate companies. So, no one's building rent for sale units because that's what the market finds profitable right now.
Thank you, Mr. Warburton. I'll turn the floor over now to MLA Bonnet Rouge.
Merci, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, Emily Bonnet Rouge, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I had one other question regarding your company there, because the GNWT talks a lot about and have documents out in the energy division regarding climate change issues and dealing with green energy, greenhouse gas emissions, and energy efficiencies. I'm just wondering if your company considers these options for the public. Merci.
Thank you, MLA Bonnet Rouge. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, we currently don't operate in those kind of areas. We, as a building owner, I'm constantly looking for ways to run my buildings more efficient, and those often do include biomass and upgrading systems. But no, currently we don't operate on in kind of those areas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warburton. Emily Bonnet Rouge.
Well, that's fine, Madam Chair. Merci.
Thank you very much, Emily Bonnet Rouge. Members, does anybody else have any additional questions or comments for Mr. Warburton? Seeing and hearing none, Mr. Warburton, I'd really like to take this moment on behalf of committee to thank you for your time today. We really appreciated you not only taking the time but sharing your experience in housing in the Northwest Territories, and we appreciate your time here today. So thank you very much for that. Committee, I'd like to get a motion to move in camera. Thank you, MLA Knockleby, and thank you very much to the public for joining us here again today. I know that we had some challenges with internet today, but we appreciate you sticking it out with us, and hopefully it will only get better. Thank you.
Thank you.